And welcome everyone to Addictive Patterns, Breaking the Habits That Hold Us Back by Dr. Hayley Watson. And I'm going to turn it over to her for this very informative presentation.
Perfect. Thank you so much. It's lovely to connect with you all. Thank you so much for being here. So let me just share my screen. And there we go. Now I think I have to do that. All right, so that a view everyone can see. Let me just move myself out of the way. Great. So just a background about me, if you don't know me, I am a clinical psychologist. I'm the founder of Open Parachute that some of you might be using. Did that work? Does everyone see that? Oh, did someone say something? Kathy, can you see the presentation?
Yes, we can, Hayley.
Great. Okay, perfect. Amazing. Wonderful. And so I'm really excited to share with you some strategies of how you can support yourself as an educator, and then also how to support students. So this is sort of universal strategies that we can use ourselves and also support the other people in our lives that might be struggling with these kinds of patterns. And the main thing to sort of start with is really thinking through what is an addictive pattern. Like, we all have our image or thought of what addiction looks like. And so I'd like to sort of just anchor the discussion in terms of what are addictive patterns. So in terms of just sort of thinking through the different types of things that we can become addicted to. If you think of the types of things, they're a lot more varied than we might imagine. So when we think about addiction, it's basically anything that we do compulsively. So anything that we do where we're not necessarily consciously choosing our actions all the time. So the types of things that we do that we might look back and go, oh, why did I do that? Or we have that kind of sinking feeling, or we're not quite sure why we're in cycles. And we're going to get into sort of how that happens and why that happens. But I want to talk about first the types of things that we can become addicted to. So one of them is relationships and validation, something we don't always think about, but that need to be validated by someone, that need to be in a relationship, that need to have someone else affirm our reality or make it feel like we're okay to be who we are. And so this can happen at any age, really. Lots of the times I remember, being a teenager, I found this exceptionally a lot stronger even, and then as I got older it got a little bit less, but that desire to have someone tell us that we're loved and that we're okay, that can be very addicting. And so we're going to get into in a second how you distinguish this and how it manifests, because I'm definitely not saying that being in a relationship or wanting to be loved always is a negative thing. And that's true with every addiction. There's very few things that are just inherently bad, full stop. It's more our relationship to them. How are we using that thing or experience in our life? So relationships and validation is a big one. It's also possible to be addicted to work, working hard, overworking, being busy. That's something that comes up for me a lot. And success. So that addictive cycle of, for me, it's about accomplishment, just wanting to feel like I've accomplished something. That can make us fall into a bit of an addictive pattern with it, because we start to do it compulsively without kind of consciously thinking, is this really what I want to be doing right now? Is this actually the best use of my time and what makes me whole? Or am I kind of caught in this cycle where I feel like I have to get something accomplished all the time? Also, of course, the classic ones. So food, alcohol, caffeine, drugs, these are very real, absolutely. And these ones can have the added challenge where there's also a stimulant or something about it that is addictive beyond the emotional addiction. So what we're talking about with sort of relationships and validation and work and success, it's an emotional addiction. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that happens. But when we bring in sort of food, alcohol, caffeine, drugs, we then also can have a physical addiction. So it makes it even harder, because not only does our sort of body and our mind and our emotions crave that thing, but also our body is craving that thing. So that sort of has another layer of complexity to it. Then, of course, technology, which also has some really reinforcing aspects. So technology is exciting for our brain. It's, it takes a lot of our attention, and it's very stimulating. So I absolutely find if it's late at night and I'm looking at my phone or a computer, it's pretty hard to put it down. It's pretty hard not to just kind of zone out with it, because it sort of just sucks you in. So that has that next layer of complications as well. But then we can also be addicted simply to drama and conflict. So when you think kind of globally at our world, and you look at things like the news, and you look at, the fights and the amount of shows that are about, reality shows that are about conflict, and even in the political sphere, how much of it is about conflict and drama. This really shows kind of our cultural addictive patterns to that. And again, we're going to talk about how this all manifests, but it's that pull of, if I'm focused on a conflict or something dramatic, it actually takes me away from my real experience. And that's the whole underpinning of all addictions. Is my experience right now is pretty tricky, it's pretty overwhelming, it's pretty hard. And if I focus on that thing over there, then my mind can go there, and I don't really have to face the moment that I'm in. So that's partly why we can really get sucked into things that have drama and conflict. And sometimes it's watching things, watching shows, watching things play out, that voyeurism. But then sometimes it's also in our own lives. So we can find ourselves in, constant conflicts, things always in a fight with someone, or someone's always getting upset with us or something, because it's a way for us, it's a place for us to focus on. And sometimes it's a place for us to feel that we're valuable, in a sense. If I'm in a conflict, if someone's upset with me, then I have something to focus on, I have something to talk about, I have something to push up against. So that's a common way that we can kind of get caught up in that. And then, of course, there is things like exercise, which in and of itself is fabulous. But if we are compulsively exercising and we feel like we have to exercise, or restricting food, again, that compulsiveness of, wanting to not have food, or wanting to have that feeling of an empty stomach, that can be very addictive also. So these are all sort of general categories of the types of things that can pull us into these patterns. And the main thing to remember about addictive patterns is that they limit our ability to act in a way that's good for us in any given moment. That's the problem. So there's no problem with a lot of these things in general. It's okay to have, to want to dip into these things. It's okay to do things that are not so great for us from time to time. That's okay. But if we developed an addictive pattern with it, we lose the ability to check in with ourselves and make a decision that's good for us in the moment. And that's why they can be such a slippery slope. And that's why, no matter what age we are, it's really important to look at this stuff and really pay attention. Is this actually the choice that I want to make? And is it in tune with who I am and what's actually good for me? Or am I just doing this because I have a pattern of doing this, and I'm doing this because there's something that's pulling me there? So it's really all about having autonomy in our actions, because that's the only way that we actually can build the life we love. Our addictive patterns, no matter what they are, can take us away from being the person we want to be, from having the relationships we want to have, from having the life experiences that we want to have, because they become kind of dominant in our focus. Okay, so what actually happens? How do we develop these addictive patterns? So what happens in our brain is that something hard happens for us. And this could be any number of things. Something hard happens and a difficult feeling gets triggered. So someone says something mean and I feel sad. I come home and I'm all alone and I feel lonely. Something scary happens and I'm afraid. So whatever it is, we have a difficult feeling that's triggered. in that moment, it's really hard for us to deal with difficult feelings. It's hard for anyone, but especially if we're stressed and overtired, or things are really hard, or we don't have a lot of support, or whatever it is. We want to get away from the feeling. So we do something to avoid it. And that is anything on that list I just showed. So sometimes we cause a fight because we're overwhelmed and we don't know we don't want to feel that way. So we start getting angry with someone else. Sometimes we grab something to eat because we just want to bury that feeling. Sometimes we grab our phone and start scrolling because we just want to get away from that feeling of loneliness or boredom. And when we do that, we get a hit of dopamine in our brain. And there's just a sort of chemical thing that happens as soon as we start focusing on something that's interesting or exciting or relevant to us. That's what dopamine does. Dopamine tells us this is important. And when we get that rush, it feels really good. So this is very important. So we go from feeling uncomfortable and sad or whatever it is to all of a sudden feeling really switched on, excited, and we've buried that first feeling. So it's a pleasant experience for us. Now, that in and of itself is not a problem. It's okay to want to bring yourself out of a hard feeling, and it's okay to want to seek a pleasurable feeling. That's fine if that's all that happened. But the problem is our mind is really tricky. So our brain learns from every single thing we do. So every time we make a choice, our brain is like this algorithm that's constantly going, what can I learn? It's like this really fancy artificial intelligence machine that's going, what happened here? How do I factor that in? What does this mean? And it's always coming up with patterns, because the way we operate is not in pieces. We don't do one thing in one situation and then turn around and do something totally different in another situation, because we don't have the brain capacity for that. Everything comes in these patterns. So, for example, we can recognize faces when they're turned sideways because our brain has this way of being able to say, that's roughly what this person looks like. So if I see them from the side, I can put them into this pattern, and we can recognize things in lots of different ways. Or we can understand that, a couch or a sofa has the same function as a chair because our brain puts it into these patterns. So when we do something to avoid a feeling, our brain learns, and then every time we feel that feeling, our brain signals us to do that same thing. And addictive patterns can take some time to develop, but they can also develop really, really quickly. That's the tricky part about them. If we're feeling really low and immediately we start feeling amazing, our brain is going to go, great, that was a fantastic outcome. I'm going to do that every single time. And so then we get this really strong urge. So all of a sudden we're feeling sad or lonely, and we have this urge to pick up our phone and start scrolling on it, and it becomes unconscious. And so the more times we do the addictive pattern, the harder it is to break, because our brain gets more and more used to it. It says, this is the thing that works, I'm going to keep doing it. Now, the reason that's a challenge is that if we always avoid our feelings, we're not dealing with the reason we were sad or lonely in the first place. So it's kind of like a Band-Aid solution. So we're really sad and lonely, and then we do something like eat ice cream or scroll on Instagram, and we feel better in the moment. But the reason we were sad and lonely is because we don't have friendships that are meaningful. Now, eating ice cream and scrolling on Instagram does not give us friendships that are meaningful. And so all we've done is learned, how do I put a Band-Aid on top of a problem that really I need to solve in my life? So if we don't let ourselves feel the feeling, we never resolve the reason why we felt that way. And this is why addictions can be so damaging, because we stop being able to even recognize what the problem is in the first place, because we're so used to just avoiding it. And so we don't even know, I am sad and I am lonely and I do want to build friendships. And so we don't. And then we sit in our room and we have scroll on Instagram and we eat ice cream, and then we become more and more sad and lonely, but we don't have the skills and resources to do anything about it because we're just caught in that pattern. So that's kind of how this manifests. Now, the good news about our brain, I know that's sort of a lot of bad news. The good news about our brain is something that we call neuroplasticity. So all that means is just a fancy word for saying our brains can change. So in the same way that our brain can learn every single time we make a choice to follow an addictive pattern, our brain also learns every time we make a different choice. So this is the really exciting part about this. So our brain can always learn a new pathway. For our whole lives, no matter how old we are, our brain can always learn a new pathway. And it really just requires 3 things. And so what we're going to talk about is these 3 things, how we make these shifts. And we're going to talk about it from 2 ways, from the point of view of yourselves, and then also from the point of view of supporting other people like your students. Because the whole approach when we're thinking about supporting other people with challenges, if we have experienced it and thought about it and made it personal for us, we're in the absolute best position to support someone else. So even if you feel like you don't have any addictive patterns, I encourage you to, in this next piece of the presentation, really think about how you can make it personal for yourself and see if you can find something, because we all have something, whether it's a big or little. See if you can work with something personal for yourself so that you really get this concept and that you can talk about it in a meaningful way to other people, to students that you support. Because we really want to talk about it in a personal way, not in a, this is your problem and this is how you need to solve it way, but in a, this is a universal human challenge and we all struggle with it. And here's some things that can help all of us. So as we talk through, I'm going to use lots of personal examples so that you can sort of hear and understand where I'm coming from and my experience. And that can sort of serve as a bit of role modeling of how you want to introduce this when you're supporting other people. So the 3 things that we need to break addictive patterns. The first step is we have to notice it. And that sounds really obvious, but it's actually not that easy. Noticing the pattern is a pretty big thing to do, because for the most part, what we do in our day-to-day life is pretty unconscious. I think the stats are like 90% of what happens in our brain, or 95% of what happens in our brain is unconscious. So to notice, we have to really be paying attention, and we have to really get clear and ask ourselves the deep questions of, why am I doing what I'm doing? What is happening here? So we have to notice. That's the first step. The second step is we have to do something different. We're going to talk in a little bit about what that looks like. But anything that we do different upsets the cycle. So that's the good news. So we just have to make a change. So whatever the pattern is, we have to do something different. And then we have to repeat it. So if we really want to change an addictive pattern, generally speaking, we have to make a plan to do the same change or do a change that we want to make every day, every time, whatever it is, for a certain amount of time. Because if we just break it once, when you think about how many times we've repeated the pattern in a certain way, we have to counteract that with doing the change as many times as we possibly can, so that when our brain is presented with this new situation, it doesn't have one pathway that's been trodden on and is a sort of a super highway going to the feeling relief, and then they have sort of this trail in the woods that's barely been used. We want 2 roads, and ideally this one becomes stronger and stronger and stronger, so that our brain stops thinking about that addictive pattern because it's no longer really on the radar. So we have to make sure that we're repeating this change. And so we're going to go through these steps, and I'm going to give you a chance to be thinking about a pattern of yours, to actually figure out how you could break that so that you can support yourself, and then also so that you can support your students. Okay, so the first step is to notice. So we have to see, what's the equation? What is happening here? So I encourage you to as you're sitting there, and I'm going to go through the examples of what these are, I'd love for you to write down an example for yourself, so something personal. And after we go through it, I'll ask if anyone has an example they want to share. You don't have to share about yourself. You can talk about someone you know or a student. But when you do this part of it, I encourage you to focus on yourself. See if you can think of a pattern that you have that you could fit into this category. You could also think of someone else if you want, but ideally you're kind of thinking about your own patterns here. So the first step of noticing is just paying attention to the pattern. What's happening? When is it happening? What is actually going on? So I'll give you an example of me in this. So I've got lots of different addictive tendencies across my life, but one thing that was particularly a big deal for me, probably about 10 years ago and younger, was binge eating. So when I would get stressed and when I would have long days or when I would be overwhelmed, I would immediately turn to eating something to ease that sense of stress. And I wouldn't be able to stop. So I would kind of just have these binges, and I'd have, whatever, bags of chips or lots of things. And it's a funny thing when you get into binge eating patterns, because it's almost like you're so out of yourself that I didn't feel full. You don't feel full when you're doing that. You're just sort of compulsively eating, because you're not actually eating to get full in your stomach. You're eating to get rid of a feeling. So it's a very different type of eating. And so that would happen, pretty regularly when I would get stressed and overwhelmed. So it was food was the subject of this one. So think of something for yourself. What is something that you've turned to? We had that whole list at the beginning. It could be anything. It could be relationships. It could be overworking. It could be, a substance. It could be anything. So the next question is, how is it being reinforced? So this is really important in terms of thinking, why is this being maintained? Why is this something that I'm continuing to do? So what around me is giving me the message or supporting this? Because we have to remember, we're always in a system. And so if we're doing something that's unhelpful or unhealthy, there's probably things around us that are contributing to that, because we don't operate on our own. And so it's important for us to recognize that sometimes our environment is not that helpful. So for me, definitely a couple of things that were reinforcing it for me. I had friends that also did sort of binge. So we would do it together as well. And it was very normalized. So that was definitely a part of it. It was something that when we got together and had fun, we would just like eat tons. I also associated eating with celebrating. So anytime I was, feeling good or I wanted to celebrate, I would always eat a lot, because that was sort of partly in my brain of, this is how you celebrate is through eating, which is something that a lot of us learn as kids. And then also the other thing is that my stress levels were pretty consistent. So I didn't have sort of an easy, simple job at that point. I was consistently getting more and more work. So I wasn't helping myself, or my environment wasn't helping me in that sense, because I was stressed a lot. And so I didn't have any other coping skills. And that is a really important thing to understand, is to look at, what am I doing? And if I'm doing it, there's a reason. So I would have learned it from somewhere, and it's helping me in some way. So I didn't have other ways of dealing with my stress at that point. So that was all the things that were going on. So I'd love you to take a second to just think of what elements in your life might be contributing to that. And again, think about yourself, or think about a student, or think about someone you know. But how is it being reinforced? What are the things that are contributing to that pattern being maintained? That's the second piece. Okay, so the third question is, what is the feeling underneath? So this is a really important one because remember, addictive patterns are always about escaping or avoiding a feeling. So for me, when I really think about that and thought about that, definitely the first feeling was stress or fear. But underneath that, there was definitely a sadness. And there was a loneliness, I would say, a sadness and a loneliness. And once I kind of figured out what was happening and resolved some of this, which we're going to get to in a second, how we do that, what I can see now is I was sad and I was lonely because I wasn't connecting to myself. So because I was in this pattern of, you know, doing a lot, which I always do that, that's consistent in my life, but doing a lot unconsciously, let's say. So just doing without really connecting to who I am or what I wanted in my life. And I was escaping a lot, escaping out of my head and escaping kind of my reality. And so when you do that, when you avoid a lot, you end up feeling really isolated because the one person that's meant to care about you and take care of you, yourself, is ignoring you. So when you ignore yourself, you start to feel pretty sad and pretty lonely. So that was the feeling that I was trying to get away from, is that feeling of, after a long, hard day of being stressed and silencing my own needs consistently, you know, my needs for a break or my needs for a snack because I'm hungry, or my needs for whatever my needs were, I wasn't listening to it. So when I got home and all of a sudden it was just me, all I was a bag of needs is what you can kind of think of it as. So that's what sort of was happening for me. That was the feeling. So think about a feeling for you, and we're going to do a little exercise in a second that helps you connect a little bit more to that feeling. So the next question is, why haven't I changed it yet? So this is a really important one, and it's so powerful and so important that we think about compassion in this. So there is a reason why we've done this. It's not because we're terrible people, and for anyone that you're supporting, it's not because they're a terrible person. It's because we don't know any better. So when we zoom out and we look at it, and when I looked at this experience, I really didn't learn, and I didn't have support systems around me that were helping me understand how to self-soothe, how to listen to myself. This was not a skill set that I knew about. That's one of the reasons coming out of this that I created Open Parachute, because I really felt and knew the danger and the challenge when you just don't have any other strategies available to you. So this is important because we can get really self-critical. So thinking about yourself or thinking about anyone that you support, it's really important that we come from a place of compassion, because we only do things because we don't know another way. That's true of anything, no matter what unhelpful choices we make. So we really want to keep that in mind. So think of that from your perspective. Again, ideally you're thinking about yourself, but you could also be thinking about a student or someone else. And just have that mapped out in terms of, what is the pattern, what's happening, what is the feeling, why isn't it changed? Okay, so now we move on. Once we're clear about that, and it's okay if some of those are question marks still. You know, if you're thinking about supporting someone else, or if you're thinking about yourself even, sometimes we don't know the full story, but we kind of have a little bit of a sense. We have a guess. This is what I think's going on. And it's pretty hard to understand these things until we start peeling back the layers. So you might not know what the feeling is until you do the next part, which is make the change. Then the feeling comes up and reveals itself to you pretty quickly. Okay, so think about that example. Now, the next step is that we make a change. We do something different. So the first thing we have to do is, when we make that change, we have to feel the feeling. This is the part that's hard. This is why we don't change addictive patterns. We have to feel the feeling that's underneath this, that's driving this, our desire to avoid it. Then as you feel the feeling, so you take away your object of what your pattern is. So you make a you stop doing the thing, you don't follow the urge. You feel the sadness or the loneliness that's underneath it. Then you give yourself what you really need, which when you connect to the feeling, it becomes pretty obvious what you need. So for me, feeling sad and lonely, I needed to connect to myself more. What I needed was connection. Sometimes we need kindness, but you have to give it to yourself. So we can't seek it externally. We have to figure out, how can I feel more connected, more safe, more supported, and what can I do to support that in myself? Because if we try to seek it somewhere else, then we just have a different addictive pattern. So if we go from being addicted to a substance and then all of a sudden we just start using our relationships to fill that void, then we're addicted to that. So it's okay if we need these crutches. It's okay if our addictions bounce around a little bit. But ultimately, what we're learning is, how do I give that to myself? What can I do to make myself feel a little bit more connected? Do I need more time on my own? Do I need some more social time? Do I need to listen to myself throughout the day to give myself little breaks? Do I need to be a little bit kinder to myself and my thoughts? What is it that I need to help with this feeling? So before we move on, I want to do a quick mindfulness exercise where we really just check into, what does that mean? How do we connect to that? So this is something you can do yourself. This is also something you can use to support someone else, just a way of kind of touching into these things. So if you feel comfortable, I'd love for you to close your eyes and just get comfortable in your seat. And I want you to think of your own pattern. So think of the thing that you do that you wish you could stop doing, or that you know you do compulsively, that you know is not helpful for you. And I want you to imagine you're doing this thing right now. You know, you're grabbing that phone and scrolling, you're getting caught up in drama, you're overworking, whatever it is that you do, just imagine you're doing it right now. And now really feel into your body and notice what you feel in your body. So I want you to first notice your muscles. Notice any tension. Notice what's happening in sort of the outer part of your body. What do you feel? Where is it tense? Where are you constricted? And then see if you can go deeper into your body and notice your sort of inner body and your belly and your insides. And notice if you can feel anything in that part of your body. Do you feel sort of a knot in your stomach? Do you feel a tension sort of in your core? Just see if you can touch into sort of that deeper part of your body. Now, I want you to see if you can notice what the feeling is underneath that. So imagine that you're in the ocean and we've just looked at the surface layer. So the layer where maybe there's storms on the surface of the ocean, there's sort of a lot of movement, or maybe there's sort of glass and there's no movement at all, and it's hard to touch into, whatever it looked like for you when you first felt into your body. And we're going deep into the ocean. So we're getting into the layers of the ocean that are calmer, and there's just a really gentle current, and we're just sinking into our own bodies. And I just want you to feel what feeling is in this depth in yourself. What's the deepest feeling you can identify? If you imagine traveling down in your body down to this core. So if you started with sort of an anxiety or a tension or a discomfort, can you see what's underneath that? Can you see if there's a layer of maybe sadness underneath that, or anger? See if you can go deeper. Is there a loneliness? Is there a sorrow? Is there grief? We're just seeing if you can notice for yourself what's the deepest feeling that's part of this pattern for you. Just see if you can feel that for a moment. So now, as you're feeling this feeling, trying to touch into this deepest feeling, see if you can ask yourself, what does this feeling need? What do I need? Imagine that it's sort of the little you, the child version of you. What does this child version of you need? If this was a child, what would you give this person? What do they need? Do they need a hug? Do they need support? Do they need, people to rely on? Do they need kindness? Do they need excitement? What do they need? See if you can notice what you need, what this feeling is telling you that you need. And then see if you can think of a way to give yourself what you need. So, very literally, if you need love, how can you love yourself more? If you need support, how can you support yourself more? See if you can just notice what's something you could do to give yourself that thing. Okay, when you're ready, you can slowly open your eyes. And I'd love for you to just write some insights down for a second. What came from that for you? What did you notice? Sometimes we feel a lot in those things and it can be really powerful. Sometimes it's hard to connect, and that's okay too, because that's telling us something. Sometimes when I'm stressed and busy, it's hard for me to even get into my body sometimes. So that's telling us, okay, that's where our mind is at. So we're not judging ourselves, we're just noticing what came up for you. Did you get an insight? See if you can track that. So that is the process of feeling your feeling and making a change and seeing if you can get that need met in another way. So in a little nutshell, how we deal with addictive patterns is that exact process, that very process. So the reason why it's so important for you to go through that yourself is that when you're in front of someone else that you're trying to support, or for yourself, if you're trying to support yourself, you want to have that framework of knowing that's all that needs to happen right now. Doesn't mean some people, especially if you're supporting students, they might not want you to lead them through a mindfulness exercise, and that's okay. Sometimes that's pretty confronting for people. But if you have a framework of all they really need is to feel that feeling and know that they have what they need to support themselves, if you have that framework, you can really effectively communicate with anyone that's caught up in a pattern. Just knowing, okay, I just need to help them feel the feeling, know that the feeling's okay, and that'll give them a different pattern in their brain. So that's the framework we want to have. Okay, so the third step, we have to make a plan, because remember, we have to repeat this. So I want you to do this yourself. I really encourage you to do this yourself, because if you've done this yourself, you can then have a meaningful and relatable and authentic conversation with the people that you're trying to support. If you haven't done it yourself, then you're just dictating and people feel that. So I want you to make a plan for yourself that's specific. So whatever the pattern is that you were thinking about, when are you going to do it? Are you going to stop, not look at your phone for a day or a week? Probably a week's hard if you're going to do phone. What are you going to do? What is the plan? So I'll give you an example of me as we go through this real quick. So one of the things that throughout the course of my life that wasn't great for me was alcohol. So I went through a phase where I was just drinking a lot. It was in the time where I was binge eating as well. So I was sort of binge drinking, in that way that is pretty socially normalized. I was just partying. Um, and so went without alcohol for 1 month. And at that point in my life, that seemed like a really big deal. And so not doing it was pretty tricky, but I had sort of this plan of, okay, I'm going to do it for a month, not going to have any alcohol. So that was my sort of specific plan. So you want to do that. So some sort of a time frame. What are you going to do? What are the parameters? Then the next question is, how can you meet your own needs? So how are you going to help yourself when you're in those moments where for me, what I realized when I stopped drinking alcohol is that I was actually pretty socially anxious, which is something I did not know about myself. So how do I deal with those feelings of insecurity and feeling like I'm being judged and all those things that really got wiped away when I was drinking? So for me, one of the things that really helped was I started doing regular yoga classes. And so for a while, I was doing kind of yoga almost every day, because remembering, ultimately we're trying to get our needs met from ourselves, but it's okay if we need these crutches along the way. Like, I probably was a bit addicted to yoga for a period of time, but that's okay, because it was a better place for me to put my addiction while I still needed something external. But yoga was very helpful because it was training me to go into my body. So think for yourself, what can you do when you're taking this thing away? What can you do to help yourself with that? Can you make a plan to take a bath every evening instead of going on your phone, or whatever it is that you can help you meet your needs? And then what will your reward be? So this is an important piece. You want to make sure that you have something that can motivate you and something that can give you that reward. So for me, I'm very competitive. So for me, the reward, really, I had a self-affirming reward. If I could do that, I would feel so accomplished with myself. If I could go a month, and I told people about it, so it became a whole thing. So for me, that was a good reward. But you might want to have a reward like you're gonna buy something that you really want to buy at the end of this if you do it, or you can treat yourself to a really great meal, or whatever it is. You want to have something that you can strive for, because that can keep you on track. And then who can help you? So do if you have a therapist or someone that can help you with this. I had a therapist when I was going through this, and that was very helpful. Do you have friends that can help you? Do you have a partner that can help you? Just make sure that you have that social support, because it's really hard to change a pattern, very hard. So you want to make sure that you have that support. And then track your learning. Notice, pay attention. Even if you're doing it for 5 minutes or an hour or a day, notice what comes up for you. Because what came up for me in that month, it was fascinating. I ended up after that not drinking for like 5 years because it felt so good. And I really kind of needed to change my relationship to alcohol. But I also, through that, it was really interesting, because it led to me then starting to notice some of my patterns in relationships, and how I really was addicted to that validation in a relationship, which I never would have noticed if I didn't start with the alcohol. So I started, trying to break that pattern, and being single and being on my own. And that was a big deal for me. And then interestingly, the binge eating stopped literally on its own. I never did anything to stop that. But because I was breaking all these other patterns, I was actually learning how to sit with my feelings. I was understanding what that means in a big way. And so I just got to a point where it wasn't an issue anymore. So this is the great thing, that everything is interconnected. And so if we pay attention and we track what's happening, we can really make significant changes in our lives. And really, when I look back at who I was in that time, everything feels different now, because of sort of getting more autonomous in my actions and getting more connected with myself. I know we're just about out of time, so I would just skip through really quickly here to how do you support someone else, so students, and also kind of just the summary of what we're doing. We start with empathy. So this is where your own experience matters. I get it. Then What does it feel like? What happens for you? What's going on in your life? What happens when you're craving that? What's it like for you? How is it impacting you? So we really want to help someone see, what's getting in the way? Does it get in the way of your friendships? Does it make you feel bad about yourself? And then what's the smallest step? That's it, because all it is to break patterns is just noticing the pattern, noticing how it's impacting us, noticing what the feeling is, and then what's one tiny step. And it's really important that we start small, because every little step makes a big difference, and it's really hard to change big patterns. So you want to start with something little, knowing that everything is a domino effect. So when you change one pattern, you will help yourself change other things. So what's one tiny step that you can stick with? If you can find a step that you can stick with, or whoever you're supporting can stick with, that's all you need to do. And so this is sort of the framework in terms of how you can help someone shift their pattern. Okay, I will wrap it up there. Let me just stop sharing. Happy to stay on if anyone has any questions to finish off, but thank you so much for paying attention, everyone.